Come on. Ich glaube, es macht keinen Unterschied. Since the talk is held in English, I will also introduce Anna and Alex in English today. Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome to our architecture talks. We started the series last year mostly to connect to like-minded people in the field of architecture and to spark some creativity again and to learn from other people's experiences and approaches outside of our day-to-day practice. So we are happy to have you here for our third talk today, which will be held by Anna and Alex, co-founders of Plural Studio. We met Anna actually at our last event, the talk held by Kevin Kimwell, and we approached Anna and Alex earlier this year to see if they would be interested to share some insights and some projects today with all of us. So thank you very much for joining us, Anna and Alex, and we will now hear your talk on books and builds, from traumatic memory culture to learning with bodies.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. We're really happy to be here and that you guys have made it up here in warm, summery weather. See if we can move to our first title slide. I guess our intention this evening is to share a bit about Plural Studio that Alex and I have been, well, we've been collaborating for the last 10 years or so, but Plural Studio itself is, I guess, around 3 years old. And it's, for us, about critical thinking in art and architecture. And so for this talk, we've come up with this title, From Traumatic Memory Culture to Learning with Bodies, as a way to take a specific perspective or lens on our work as we're thinking about it right now. This kind of changes all the time to reframe and work through new ideas. So this is where we're at the minute.
Yeah, and this is the kind of unofficial subtitle to my current book project, which is called 1001 Accurate Memories. So the subtitle is very subtly presented on the back. Before we get started, I just wanted to say that, I mean, I really appreciate the platform and what you guys are doing with inviting people in. I think this is a great initiative. There'll be, as the title suggests, there'll be a discussion of sort of the way that trauma has been remembered historically. And there will be a short discussion of police violence, which is not graphic, but just so long as you know, it's good to have these things prepared before, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe to kind of start the talk, we'll come with some references of things you may have seen before or maybe not. 10 years or so ago, Alex started writing this book, Here Comes Trouble. And we started getting into some discussion around his thesis of an inquiry into art, magic, and madness as deviant knowledge. And I said, hey, you need to look at witches, you need to look at Silvia Federici, she's got these amazing texts. And at the time I was in a project in Norway, and so we took a road trip up to see this memorial, which is at Steilneset, and is to commemorate the witch trials and the witch executions at the border between Norway and Russia. And the two buildings here are designed as memorials by Peter Zumthor and Louise Bourgeois. So one very famous architect and one incredibly famous artist coming and reacting to this social trauma from the 1600s, 1700s?
Yeah, 1600s. I mean, it's worth maybe...
Before we move on.
Yeah, I guess there was a lot of things involved in the research which pertain to this, maybe like a false dichotomy between traumatic memory culture and learning with bodies. I mean, both these things can be kind of actually difficult. Both these things can be kind of dug into in great depth. And I think sort of part of what came out of this research was this enclosure of the commons. So this kind of alienation and individualization of society over time.
Yeah, so what we found when we visited and we were really struck by was the difference in approaches between what an architect proposes and what an artist proposes to deal with what happened in this place. And the proposal by Peter Zumthor is an elongated, stretched out space with all of the names and stories of each of the hundreds of people that were killed over this time period, and little windows and lights. And then the proposal by Louise Bourgeois, which is, as you can see here, like a chair with an eternal flame and 7 mirrors surrounding this. And for us, what I kind of took out of this was that architecture tends to try to make things better. It tries to give the space to apologize for what happened and say, well, we're not like this anymore. Whereas art and the maybe feminist way of approaching this is screaming and dealing with something really emotional and bringing the audience and the people that are thinking about this space into the place with a kind of emotionally intact perception of what it might be like to think about those times and the times we live in now.
Yeah, and particularly, I think the difference that Anna and I articulated when we were talking about this to prepare is that these different forms of memorialization seem to be signifying something different, or they seem to be signifying, or they put import behind a particular significance. And with the Zumthor piece, as with so much memorialization, the death is the thing which is being signified, and it's very solemn and sort of ceremonial. Whereas with Bourgeois, you can see that actually what we have here is a remembrance of the lives which were lived, traumatic lives for sure, with suffering and struggle and survival. But nonetheless, the life is the thing which is being kind of foregrounded there. So that's part of our sort of proposal, perhaps, for how memorialization might be taken forward. Yeah, and so, I mean, really what I'm going to try and do just to begin with, before we get into the kind of socially engaged architectural practice that we've developed in the last few years that's also informed from some of the work that we did prior. I want to talk a little bit more about the publishing wing of Plural Studio, because I guess, if nothing else, we can have a bit more control over that. So it's a bit clearer, it's a bit more of a kind of singular narrative, if you like. And that kind of theme that we've struck upon is this kind of game of publicness, which is a phrase that the artist Andreas Siegmann uses to describe the way in which public space is kind of organized, the way in which ideas are presented in public space, the question really of whether or not public space is an environment where the proposal to do something in the public interest is used to manufacture certain social and political outcomes, or whether the public space is really the bedrock of the political process. And obviously, these are not mutually exclusive categories, and that's kind of where the studio sees the work, is kind of in this conflict, if you like, or in this discourse. And I think that idea of public space is kind of so contested and so dynamic, particularly at this point, looking at the British example, because the privatization of public services, of the space itself has become so intense, and we have this like kind of cancerous problem of the 1% globally. And so what you have, I think, is this real frustration and this real tension that boils up and becomes articulated, learning with bodies, as sort of a mass event, as a very sort of, one can read it as a violent event. I think it's fair to read it as a violent event. Although, of course, for the people who live in this community, and we lived here for 2 years while we were doing some research and working on a project in the UK, the significance of it is obviously very different from the way in which the monumentality of it has been presented all this time. So I think it's just interesting to look at like the austerity history of Britain in the last sort of 15 years, and this particular moment where it just gets pushed over, and it just gets kind of literally pushed back. And then, of course, there's this whole game which is set into motion. Oh, sorry.
Before we move forward, just to say, like, this is a statue of Colston in Bristol.
Oh, yeah, I'm assuming everyone knows this image. Like, obviously, you're all there. But yeah, so this is the statue to the famous holder of enslaved persons in Bristol, who is really held up as a savior for the city, and who for sure oversaw the deaths and enslavements of hundreds of thousands of people in that particular port, only one of several ports in Britain that were tasked with and facilitated the industrial slavery of human bodies and human lives. So this is during Black Lives Matter. Obviously, this is a point of extreme occupation of the public sphere, and a lot of discussion came out of that, which was very helpful, and a lot of discussion came out of that, which became then simply internalized into the logic of the culture and created very little change, as is the way.
So they did succeed in removing the statue, and the people who pulled it down were not...
well, two of them were charged with disruption of the peace, but they weren't imprisoned.
They weren't imprisoned.
So,
but the statue has not been put back.
Yeah, it's in a museum now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's
not probably where it belonged the whole time. I mean, at least for the last 100 years. Mm-hmm. And this image has two other quite like anchored significances in that presentation, but we'll maybe remember to come back to it, and maybe we won't. But yeah, it's just for me, it's like such a strong image, and it also sets this game of publicness into play, because as soon as you challenge the terms and the conditions and who has the agency in public space, then, of course, the state has to intervene. So what you then have in the following weeks and months is that the statue to Winston Churchill in London becomes graffitied, and it gets called into question because of his family's profits and history of being involved with the enslavement of human beings. And of course, and Churchill himself was a very racist person, and is known to have articulated many racist things and held racist beliefs. But in the way in which, of course, history is written and the monumentality of public space, he is held up as this great hero of World War II and the Holocaust. And then the people that step up to protect him are, first of all, the far right in Britain. So there you see already this initial kind of contradiction being set in play. And then you get, of course, the police that have to step up and protect the far right to protect Churchill. And in the end, it's a kind of like one of those things like, can you find the piece of bread under the 3 cups? And the state has to work out, okay, do we keep the statue? Do we leave the statue? Do we have the statue like left and therefore taken down eventually, because people would have done that? Or do we just cover the whole thing up and pretend nothing happened?
And use architecture.
Use architecture.
to cover up the situation.
Yeah, so, and that sort of feels pretty indicative of the way in which memorialization doesn't stand the test of time, and it often doesn't stand the test of like actual public discourse. And so we find this problem of like memory culture, or traumatic memory culture, as one might phrase it, exists in all of the post-colonial or neo-colonial global northern countries, particularly in Europe. Obviously in France, this is a big problem with their own colonial history. In Britain, it's a problem with their colonial history, our colonial history. And in Germany, we also have this very intracted, I would say immovable situation at the moment with the memorials to the Holocaust and World War II. And I think, again, I would draw on this dual approach to the way in which we think about how memorialization works. If we only think of memorialization as signifying that lives have come to an end, then it's very hard to engage as a living person, as a generation down the line, with what the actual kind of like role of maintaining a society where that doesn't happen again actually looks like, because it's a very dead conversation in a sense. And I think, although obviously I wouldn't want to in any way express anything other than pure solidarity with the victims of the Holocaust and World War II, I find that the situation now begs for a scenario where the memorialization There's one mic. Sorry about that. The memorial and the memory culture actually develops or progresses, one could say, into a situation where what is significant, what is being remembered, is actually the lives which were lived. Because it's the very presence of the minorities' lives which is actually the challenge. You know, it's not about simply finding a way to have a pomp and ceremony around something, you know, every once in a while. Actually, there's a real way in which you can do traumatic memory culture, which is lived. And we're going to talk about that a bit more when we get to Indonesia and the reenactment culture which they have there, which I think is really interesting and has definitely been inspirational for us. I'm trying to go a little bit on the minute here because we do have lots of other things to get onto. But there is this kind of sense now that, you know, a truth that's told with bad intent beats all the lies that you can invent, like, which is this phrase that we'll come back to again later. But there's this real sense that the public space, the public realm, the game of publicness is really starting to fall apart in Germany. And there's so much cancellation and censorship that even to articulate my thoughts or our thoughts this evening is kind of like a process of self-policing, because obviously the way in which language is regulated is very strict in Germany. And I understand that there are historical reasons for that, but actually if you start digging into the historical reasons, it's to protect the aristocracy, right? It's not to protect people like me who are migrants. It's not to protect women, you know? It's not to protect people who are actually vulnerable in society. And so I think it's really important to kind of try and draw attention to that where you can, because there is such a high level of kind of like abstraction and distance between what a politician is able to say and the reality on the ground. So I just wanted to read this post very briefly, which is just not even the most recent instance of extreme police violence in Berlin, but nonetheless, I think a significant one. So this is from the artist Anne Kiernan, who's been documenting and illustrating the frustrations of the pro-Palestine movement for the last year and a half. They were exhilarated and lost in the moment. They were given the signal to drop all inhibitions by their superiors, and they let themselves go. These were not couples lost in the heady beat of music. Polizei in riot gear, wearing illegal quartz gloves, plucked young women from the crowd and flung them through the air, punching, wrenching, and kicking, creating terror and inflicting serious bodily harm. It didn't matter who you were. If you weren't wearing riot gear, you were fair game. Journalists were pushed, punched, arrested. Medics were not immune, nor older people, nor the Ordnungsstaff. Many people have been hospitalized, good, moral people, who gathered under the spires of the church at Südstern in Berlin to mark 77 years since the Nakba. And the post goes on, but I'll leave it there. One of the things that I've been trying to do personally in response to this, since we moved back to Germany, is a podcast called Radio Against Repression, which is held monthly on the 88.4 FM. I'm not expecting that many people to hear it on the FM, but it does stream online as well. And that's with Yara Nassar, who is an actor and a performer and a screenwriter and an activist. And you may know her work from the presentation Zeit zu reden at Spore, which was, I think, late last year, where she was actually in conversation with one of the chiefs of police about police violence itself, which was really, really powerful event. So how did we get here? I mean, me and Anna, how did Plural Studio get here, right? Let's talk a little bit more about this socially engaged architecture that we've been doing as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're going to rewind to around 2017 to a project called the Bravos Foundry, located in Galicia. And basically this project started off from a friend who approached me and was one of the reasons I felt confident to sort of leave full-time employment and go into the awkward world of freelancing and teaching and starting a much more, let's say, fractured life beyond working full-time in architecture offices. But the exciting thing, I think, was that he proposed it as like a residency space that would be open to anyone that wanted to come. So not just for artists, but in a way, a place where anyone that feels like they need time away from academia or from their day-to-day life can go and be part of a small community that can build things together, garden together, share knowledge, and try things out. And the interesting thing also about the site that it's located in is that Galicia has a very long history of commoning, of sharing land and sharing resources, and also basically resisting state power in order to have shared spaces that they take care of, whether that's forests or orchards or fields, and forests play a very big part around this area. I don't know if you wanted to say something specific about this document.
Well, we extracted this from the founder, Dennis Shep's forthcoming book, Bloom, and it seems to kind of foreground some of the ideas that I guess encouraged us into it or made us feel excited about the potential of the space. Yeah, I could read the text. I'm sure everyone is more than capable of reading it, but I will read it for the audio. So the Foundry is a self-organized event space / residency project in Galicia, Spain. I'm not going to read the Spanish because that's not a language I have any type of confidence with, and we've got the translation in English anyway. Between 1467 and 1469, Galicia had been hit by an uprising, the Irmandino Wars, in which a peasantry exhausted by plagues, bad harvests, and abuses of power rejected the rule of the local nobility, proclaiming that we accept no lord nor fortress over us. Galicia has often been characterized as a periphery in both Spain and Europe. Pre-capitalist forms are still alive here. About 25% of Galician lands are common lands. Land ownership is highly decentralized. Plots are small, rent is uncommon, and small-scale farming predominates.
And the document on the right-hand side is actually like a royal decree about the ownership of this specific site. So in a way, there's some kind of conflict around this site as being a foundry for iron and the local community and how much of the land around it could be deforested to feed the fires of the foundry. So there was a lot of conflict around people that were trying to squat this foundry in order to stop some of the deforestation and also the sort of royal intensity to continue using the foundry to create various metalworks that were going into colonial expansion in South America. And at the point when we got involved on this site in 2017, the buildings there were masonry buildings from 150 years ago, and the chapel on the site is from the 16th century, and it had never been modernized or electrified properly. There weren't running toilets. It was really a ruin at the most basic level of being a kind of historic site of the foundry, then turned to farmstead and kind of a space for ritual for the local population of around 200 people living in this village, which is a very common size for villages around Galicia. And what we also got focused into at that point, I really shifted thinking about architecture from the point of view of the city and concrete and steel, and thinking much more about old buildings, and I got interested in permaculture, ethics and principles, so care of the earth, care of people, and fair share, and design principles like take slow action on the site, nurture the edge. There are 12 really nice permaculture principles that can be applied not only to gardening but also to design. And another aspect of this is, like I said, it's not just for artists, but at the same time, I think the spirit of a place like this goes along with this quote from Isabelle Fremeau and Jay Jordan, that the extractivist spirit in art must be exercised, which is something around how the way that we in today's society put art up on this pedestal, when actually like daily life with intention and like working to excel at the crafts and life that you leave is an art form in itself. So in going through what we did at the site, it was really about being there, being part of a place where you prepare a site with landscaping, bringing in a new orchard, setting up compost toilets, really some of the very first sorts of things that you do on the site, setting up shops, and sort of preparing all the different ways that people could start to deal with the landscape, but also the interiors of the building. So repointing spaces maybe that had been improperly treated, working as a community to build up spaces to have parties. Alex and I worked very intensely on this small structure. That's him, but also involving other people in creating spaces for celebration. And there were large plans to extend the building, so to put another story on top and extend the landscape. Eventually, because of the chapel building, the heritage department there rejected the extension of the building. But in the end, like I said, this was somehow a gift, because it made things slow down and it made it clear that we could take time to do things like dig out one of the rooms to put in a new earth-based floor as a group of people, learning how to deal with this building in a really sensitive way. The breathability of old buildings is often left to the side, and then they start to rot on their own. When concrete and plastics are brought in uninformed ways, then they end up building up moisture and in the wrong places, and the rocks crack, or the wood inside the buildings ends up rotting. So this is one example of how we ended up redoing what was just a dirt floor before to build it up and add slate interior into a very kind of rustic space, but also inviting lots of people to come to the space and look at the soil and test it and build terraces and gardens, and also refurbish old windows, creating the possibility to re-enclose the space at a very kind of hands-on way, right? There are people that come there and they get to take things off and repair them and make the place new again in a way that doesn't extensively change its feeling. So obviously this also goes along with activating it again with dinners and inviting the village around to participate in rituals that hadn't gone on for a long time, or bringing the witches back.
No doubt. Yeah, well, this is slightly, I mean, I didn't want to segue from witches to Alexa, but maybe Alexa is a form of, yeah, I don't know, entity. But yeah, so we've been lucky enough to do a bunch of different projects in different contexts, and we just want to speak fairly briefly about our engagement in Jakarta in Indonesia, because we were there for 2 months in Indonesia, and we had this opportunities to do a residency with the IFA Gallery and Kunci Cultural Studies Center in Yogyakarta, and Rujak community space in Jakarta, and we worked collaboratively with 2 Australian artists, Jorgen Doyle and Hannah Ekin, and 2 Indonesian artists, Tita Selina and Erwin Ahmet. And we did a 2-week coastal walk across the north coast of Jakarta with them, improvisational sleeping situations. But that's something which we've documented elsewhere, so we're not going to talk about that today. But that culminated, we weren't planning to make any work when we went to do the residency. We were there to kind of observe and learn, essentially. But we were encouraged to be in the group show in the Jakarta History Museum, which was a great honor, to be honest, with many, many different Indonesian artists, and a really open approach from the museum with regards to how they handle the historic elements that they have. So the Jakarta History Museum was the town hall of the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company in the 1500s. Like, you know, the first global corporation, very brutal, of course, like all colonial projects. They had a cellar. This is the sign for the cells where inmates were forcibly kept in the basement at 50.
Because the building functioned not only as a town hall, but also as a courthouse and as the prison. So it's centrally located in what would have been a fortified village at that time. And that's where they sort of made all of the decisions around justice.
Yes, and carried out executions as well. And actually just being in the prison cell for a very short period of time was very often a death sentence, because there were 50 people, up to 50 people kept in this space, it's about this high. So it's about 2.5 meters high. And you can see that the ball and chains which they used then, these are the original ones from 400 years ago. And the museum is of a mind that these are living, breathing artifacts. They're not to be kept behind glass plate doors or whatever. Like, you can interact with them. And they were, you know, very open to us locking Alexa to some of these. Because the premise of the work which we came up with was that essentially at the time, Jeff Bezos was like the world's richest person. And we thought that it was a kind of form of symbolic justice to put the technology that facilitates so much of the surveillance capitalism of our lives into the prison cell of the first global corporation.
I guess you guys are familiar with the idea of Alexa, a personal assistant speaker, right?
So the thing with Alexa is that it proposes to only be recording you after you've said the wake word. But actually, we did a lot of testing, and Alexa was recording like all the time. We actually have a zine on digital security, which maybe is a better place to like get into all of that. But needless to say, this is sort of 2018. I think the discourse was still kind of coming out of the box at this point. That you know, surveillance capitalism was probably about Shoshana Zuboff was like 1 year old at that point. But we've been looking at it for a couple of years, and we wanted to kind of create something that would be interactive for the public, and that also spoke to the place where a lot of this technology is made in Southeast Asia and China, but that also was something that we could leave behind because we were unable to be there in attendance for this show. So we had to set this work up and then fly back to Europe, where you can actually monitor what Alexa is hearing online. So we created radio shows with the requests which the public were giving to Alexa. And we also had a kind of a speaker set up.
I think it was best in that. Yeah,
next to it, where we sort of trained the algorithm in a hotel room by setting up prompts. So we were essentially putting Alexa on trial with gaps, so the public could also interact. So like long 30-minute gaps. And then the docent of the museum kind of took this on and introduced it. And it sort of built up, and there were like hundreds of thousands of people, because there are hundreds of thousands of people going through the museum every week. So it was like a big exposure for us. But it also meant that the show was extended into Ramadan. And so by the end of the show, people were walking past and Alexa was sending out the call to prayer, because it had picked up a request to turn on the radio, and the radio was playing the call to prayer during Ramadan. So it was as though Alexa had kind of like converted in prison and found faith. And that was like this like perfect holistic, we'll never create anything like that again. It's too perfect.
I think what's also for us looking at this piece now and thinking about where we are now, the atmosphere generally in the History Museum in Indonesia was one of reenactment. So the other things going on around this installation that we did were like colonial reenactments of what it was like to see the beginnings of Jakarta. And there would be dressed up and have plays, but sometimes they would involve bringing the crowds in. So it was very realistic and sometimes also really violent. And it was kind of shocking to us from what we see here in Europe or the United States, from the way history museums are very much like displayed through video material or stuff behind glass, to see something so alive and participatory in the way that history is thought about. And so I think that's also what gave us some inspiration to do this piece as something alive, where Alexa is live and the people there are also live and they're interacting with each other differently than if you make like if we would have made a piece which is just to look at and have it as like a separated.
It ends up doing like quite the opposite, right? So I mean, when you make something into a sort of a ceremony, one could argue that it's also a way of creating amnesia around it and actually sort of pressing the reset button, like doing the recycling, and then I don't have to think about runaway climate change anymore. So this like enactment means that it's no longer a kind of a memory culture, it's actually just culture. It's actually just, it's being lived through the next generations. And yeah, it was very visceral. I mean, there was a lot of fake blood flying around and daggers, and even though I've worked in community theatre with reenacting colonial situations, I still found it kind of pretty edgy.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it was around that time that I also shifted what I was thinking about in architecture from being maybe a built space to also a space for thinking. So I started not long after visiting Indonesia writing this architectural novel, and asking questions about like relationships to technology and algorithms being somehow more important than human decisions, and how that also relates to trauma, because we start to become, through industrialization and through digitization, more separated from the landscape, from plants and animals, from our own bodies, from working with our hands, and also from each other. We get alienated to look at our phones rather than to actually have conversations with each other. So I started to draw up some ideas of like what it might be like to work backwards from this total abstraction that we live in social media. Thinking about, well, if we think of ourselves as users or followers, or let's say connections or creators or members, or like I said, users or friends, how that might look like if we turn those words and those things that we participate in digitally into types of architecture, and sort of set them against each other and ask what we need to do with all of this. Like, where do we go when we start to physicalize something that is currently really abstract? Because my proposal is that maybe like the words that we're using are not really enough. And that the words that we're using tend to categorize us, define us, and separate us from each other. Excuse me, there's like a gnat going around my face. Yes. And they separate us from each other. So maybe architecture can actually be used as a spatial proposal to create more relationships with each other rather than separating, and gain like more clarity around the ways that we're being manipulated if we can work in a more physical way, in a more embodied way. So maybe there's a way that I can also do that without having to build, in a time when building is also incredibly toxic to our environment and ends up creating all kinds of issues for climate change, as well as social crises. So what are ways that I can maybe use drawings in this book to get people to think, and get myself to think through the embodiment of space? And I think the potential of like a hand-drafted or a hand-drawn image of an architectural space, including plans and sections in a book in a physical book that you're holding means that the reader is asked to actually build that space for themselves, as opposed to maybe like a movie or a rendering in which the image is given immediately. But by building a space and wondering what it's like through thinking it through in plan, section, and elevation, it's an invitation to kind of participate in the making of the architecture and to co-create space, which when you actually move through a place like Berlin or a building, you start to make a mental map in any case. And I thought that maybe a work like this kind of book could offer that as well, and bringing out a kind of embodied imagination in the participation of the reader.
And also the hand of the artist drawing, right? This is something you always emphasize. It's like there's an embodied quality that's really central to how that project was taken up. So, I mean, I think the sympathy for me and maybe for both of us has been to try and think about how we can learn with the body again. Perhaps after like this long period that we've both been in of writing books, there is the opportunity to kind of progress from a cerebral, intellectual pursuit into maybe a more poetic, maybe a more creative nonfiction type of genre, and certainly a more kind of tactile form of expression. So this was a book which has just come out. It's also one of the advantages of having a press is that you get to shape things and found the discourses and the concerns that you're interested in. Going forwards, we have one other project which we're going to publish, and we're really looking forward to publishing with other artists and interdisciplinary practitioners. So we're open to conversations around that. But this is a project which went on for 7 years, and another book was written in the middle, which was much more kind of intellectual and historical. This one involves a lot more of like mark making, drawing, and it's a little bit like life itself. It's got like a beginning and a middle and an end, and the middle is kind of a mess. And the beginning seems like kind of straightforward, and the end seems like, oh, we could have done that better, couldn't we? So the middle is kind of like 1,001 accurate memories, and it's this creative nonfiction. Sometimes it's prose. Sometimes the memory locates the reader in the present, because I was completing it in the last 3 years when there was just like a lot of change going on in our lives. There was obviously the beginning of the genocide in Gaza after October the 7th. And so there were many different instances that were noteworthy and emotional. And all these emotions, all these feelings, they have a location in the body. And what I'm trying to kind of convey with this project is that the traumatic memory is essential, right? It's important to acknowledge where the traumas are. The traumas are themselves to be found in the body. So you can go through somatic therapy, you can find the traumas, you can work them out. But the thing that's really critical is the body itself. That's really the thing which I think gives a sense of a future direction, a sense of hope, a sense that we're not always living in the past, and reliving the past, as important as that is for informing the present and how we go forwards. The body is where we get things done. Actually, the body is where we begin a transcendental meditation process. The body is where ultimately we lie down and pass out of this world. But the body is also how we get together and sing and dance and demonstrate and collaborate, and in many ways process a lot of the intergenerational traumas which we all have some degree of within us, is through group experience. And that's something which humans have been doing for millions of years. So that's kind of an emphasis for that one. The final conclusion, if you like, is this idea that the accuracy of a memory really comes down to the intention behind its recollection. So if you're giving a particular argument around the way in which a group have been marginalized or stigmatized, the intent behind that argument really determines whether or not I think I'm going to take that argument as accurate or not, right? So you can make arguments that, there's anti-Semitism in Germany today as a big problem, sure, but Once you start saying that that anti-Semitism has been imported from outside, you reveal the fact that your intention behind that accurate memory is actually to shut down conversation, which in itself makes Jewish people and other minorities much more vulnerable. So this is a kind of personal as political exploration, this book itself. And I just read a very short passage, which is really one memory, from the center. I'm not sure if we're going to get to the next bit yet, so I'll just leave it on this. Which I think is maybe another way of memorializing people who pass away due to conflict situations. And so this is a recollection of the funeral in Berlin of a colleague of mine from the anti-racist theater. Salah has died, tragically. The funeral date has been chosen by his family, who have elected to have him buried in Berlin rather than flown back to Syria. I would have wanted to be there, and indeed the dates coincide with our presence in the city. It has been 2 years since I've seen a lot of the Hakawatis and other Theater X company. The pandemic and my leaving the UK have put physical distance between us. I recognize people from 2014, though amongst the faces I've known more recently. It is 2022. After the solemn greetings and mutually recalled faces, we move slowly toward what will become Salah's grave. The master of the ceremony speaks slowly in German, and someone asks me if I've seen a corpse before. It is a soft warning. The air is crisp in the morning sun. We walk slowly at a respectful distance from the immediate family and kin. It feels as though we have entered the countryside until I see the mound of earth and the sweating workers standing discreetly some meters in the distance. We walk closer to the grave. Now the faces begin to twitch and become more fixed, set into some form of concentrated preparation for the moment of entombment. Despite the warning, I am alarmed by the sight of Salah's body. His face is so real. The rehearsals at the theater flash in my thoughts. Did we ever rehearse this scene? A death scene of some kind, certainly. The moaning begins softly after the body is placed into the grave. Those tasked with the burial take turns to bring earth to the site, and slowly, as a group, he's buried. Raw emotion has gripped us. I see Hamoudi in the throng of arms and bodies sharing this last act with the deceased. Something inside of me snaps and my tears begin to flow more strongly. Uncontrollable, inconsolable, I weep at the back of the crowd for so long that by the time most people have begun to turn back to the cemetery gates, new faces have begun to appear by my side. Ahmed. I've been clutching a copy of my book for him. He notices that I've become slightly hysterical and seeks to comfort me. Listen, he says. You can still hear him practicing his lines. Yeah, other forms of complex memory are also built into the urban sphere and the fabric of our lives as we wander around those buildings. And this is a project that we did in Bristol that addresses that.
Hard to transition after such a powerful memory, but this project somehow does manage to weave a lot of our discussions as well into space, because this is a project that was also set in a court building like the one in Indonesia with prison cells underneath, and attempting to find sort of new light and new meaning in the city space of Bristol, which was also where the Colston statue was pulled down. So we had the great luck of calling Bristol our home for 2.5 years and being invited in to work with the Youth Advisory Board and a charity that are and have now reactivated this historic courthouse into a cultural and creative enterprise hub for companies to rent spaces, but then also give back to the community by offering mentorships and internships to young people, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, but just the youth in general is seen as sort of a group that's often marginalized in public space. So giving them spaces to perform in, congregate in, and socialize in, and is somehow mediating also between public space and private space in the interior of the building. So we were invited in at a really lucky moment, and we got to do some workshops around color and thinking about historic spaces, historic structures, what the meanings are that they already imply in themselves, and how some of the colors or the way that you can activate them might change the meaning or make it something more of the moment for Bristol.
Yeah, this was a project that came directly out of my background doing socially engaged art practice, and Anna's background in renovating and working with renovating buildings. And I think it's safe to say that Plural Studio kind of cut its teeth on this project, which began as a series of phone calls that I made to all the different social centers in the city when we arrived, and somehow led to the kind of material expression of a long research project that I published, but also really lovely engagement from the Youth Advisory Board. We're going to also try and be a little bit brief with this one, but basically I think it's meaningful to start with the architectural, like neoclassical form that people will recognize. This is a court building from the Victorian period, so it's about 200 years old, and it had been used as a site for illegal raves, heaven forbid, but I mean, Bristol, this is a very strong part of its culture and heritage. And then it was used as kind of like a not quite laser quest, but like a pellet shooting environment. So there were like lots of little holes in all of
the entire interior was like, it looked like it had a huge termite infestation, because the holes were much, much bigger than normal termites, but all of the wood was covered in sort of little pellet marks.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that it's pretty rare to find a building like this that actually is successful in its offering to the public, and it's such a significant building for the public, because obviously it has a long history of incarceration, sending people off to the colonies. It had members of the IRA in the cells at one point, and it's a contested space, but it's also kind of a space that I think Bristol is somehow proud of. It's a magistrate's court, so it's actually a lot of the time the history of what was being kind of judged there was actually looking after people in the public sphere, making sure that there was a degree of like decorum and I don't want to say like respect for private property, but I think kind of public decency.
Right. I would say that there's like a dual aspect to a lot of the justice that happened there in Victorian times. Some of it did protect young people, and other decisions I would say would be contested today.
Yeah, and you see with the slide that we showed, like at the very top with the statues of Edward Colston being pulled down, there's a real kind of engagement with public space in Bristol. Obviously Banksy is from there, like he's a big sort of public artist, or whatever one thinks of that. He's of course a very big part of the global brand. And so it was very interesting then to bring this kind of research, which I'd been doing more or less up until the point where we left, which ties the neoclassical architectural forms, like particularly the Corinthian order, to a 12,000-year-old sacred date palm tree from Iran and Syria. Because although this isn't something which we really got into a lot of detail with the Youth Advisory Board that were our clients, essentially, with the Creative Youth Network, who were the more kind of like formal client, and then the other stakeholders were the builders, the National Lottery Foundation, and the Heritage Foundation. So we had these five, and then the architects as well. So they're also formal architects looking at the structural stuff. We were on the interior team, or we were the interior team. And so the building had been sort of funded, defunded, refunded, underfunded. There was a whole political battle going on in Bristol. And then in the end, there was this lump of money. And so it was like, they're going to do it, we're going to finish it. And we managed to step in at the right time. And so what we found is that we were face to face with these types of architectural form, which I'd been looking at. So you can actually see that. I'll try and keep this brief, okay? This little palmette in the middle here is actually the sort of antecedent of, or the later form rather, this is the antecedent of the sacred date palm tree in 10,000 BCE. So this is the oldest one in the archaeological record. And basically what happened in my research, which produced this book project, Cultural Epigenetics and the Philosophy of Change, is that a PhD advisor, Jesuit priest in Rome, helped me through a series of recommendations for books and my own 4-year research process to go beyond the Greek canon for the Corinthian order and show that actually there's been a great deal of cultural mutation around the sacred date palm tree for 12,000 years, likely much earlier as well. But the first artifact that we have in the record is 10,000 BCE. Nonetheless, it returns again on the back of the Secret Service building in Berlin, creating a kind of cultural cycle, which is the 12,000-year cycle, which I'm referring to as cultural epigenetics. So if you know anything about epigenetics, it's the sequence of like epi markers which sit on your DNA. So when you're born, you inherit your epigenome from your parents along with this sort of muddled up DNA sequence that you get, but your environment triggers the reproduction of different types of cell from your DNA. So that's interesting because it means that you actually have a direct correlation between a traumatic experience or a healthy experience, a traumatic set of tags that you inherit, but also like a bad diet, a good diet, living next to a motorway, living next to a park. And that affects the way in which your cells are reproduced, healthy or unhealthy cells. So for me, it's not a leap to say that if you have a piece of art, i.e. a statue to someone who has enslaved hundreds of thousands of people, and you're a person of color in your environment, that's causing a form of trauma to live around that. So if you want to reset your cultural epigenome, then you do what they did to Colston and you pull that statue down. And that was indeed what I was kind of concluding, because this was like 2020, 2021 is when it was published during the time. So that meant that this very kind of emotive and direct relationship between the cultural artifacts and the architecture of Bristol and the people of Bristol, and particularly the new generation, the younger generation, was something that we directly sort of interfaced with this project.
Yeah, which is why I think thinking about all of these topics that we've been bringing to you, when we got involved with the Creative Youth Network and had the chance to actually work with through a set of workshops, 15 or so young people to make decisions around what was happening in this courthouse, really made us super excited and gave us a lot of reason to be there and be
we sympathize towards the youth because we wanted to think about this idea of justice, this idea of social justice, climate justice, who has a stake in developing
also,
these buildings.
Like joining as our bodies with them and them in person, taking on the building, going on tours of the building with them, looking at what's going on, and also inheriting the decisions that they'd already made and the things that they'd thought about. We didn't come in and try to make like our own plan for this building. We like joined a stream of people that were in Bristol and actively thinking about the problem of this courthouse. But we did bring at the same time a lot of our thinking and around research towards what the cultural hegemony looks like, cultural epigenetics from Alex's studies and research, and then managed to bring some of that across in the decision making, in which basically in a heritage building in a situation in England, it's often the case that the light color is used to highlight the plasterwork, so including the columns, the capitals, and the cornice work in the sort of upper levels of the building. And then a color will be used on the walls. And what we discussed with the group was kind of to invert this, to use a color on the upper levels and bring the lighter color into the walls. And so we managed to communicate this through our building documents and get the builders to understand that actually we'll invert this, so that instead of creating sort of a white colonnade inside of the building or as part of the cornice work or on the Corinthian columns in one of these main atrium areas, that it becomes, takes on sort of a Bristol color.
Which also was the original way in which the Corinthian columns were painted by the Greeks, right?
Maybe
it was
even
only,
more colorful, actually.
Yeah, it was only Goethe who found them white and then was like, oh, they were white because they're pure and they had the pure of spirit and so on. So it's very much cultural epigenetics, just a return to, but of course, yeah, to be in dialogue with the young people and also with the other clients meant that they would come up with crazy ideas like, let's have an electric pink carpet. And then the creative youth net would be like, you don't have to do that if you don't want. And we were like, no, I mean, that sounds great. Let's do that. So we did that in the main courtroom, which is a co-working space for them, for the young people. Mm-hmm. And as Anna said, this is bringing in young people from different demographics in society that don't have access to the cultural industry. The other clients in the building is a 3-story building that's been painted now like a James Turrell. Like, it's illuminous just from daylight. It's totally luminous everywhere you go. And the clients were absolutely flabbergasted because we kind of had turned up as like Mary Poppins and done this project with them for 2 years, and then we just returned back to Berlin. And I think they had this real sense of like, oh yeah, that's what it must be like in Berlin. Everyone is just doing, electric pink carpets. And so there is this sense that, yeah, there's like a working through of this kind of very heavy building through collaboration. Yeah.
And listening, but also bringing kind of our own understanding and thinking.
Yeah.
So we realized we've already talked for an hour. We do have one last little project that we want to mention, especially since we heard that you guys are also working on a game. A very recent project that we've been working on since last September is part of an exhibition in Hamburg at the Urbaneo Architekturzentrum in Hafen City, where they invited us to collaborate, or Stiftung Freizeit, who's done the interior design there, as the architecture center invited us, Plural Studio, to collaborate on one of the first main exhibitions for young people. So the idea is that this museum brings in young people to talk about architecture and the built environment. And they have a lot of different stations and rooms and labs and cafe. And we decided that the first exhibition we would offer would be a series of 5 games that kind of answer the question, was benötigen wir von der Architektur? What do we need from architecture? And is titled Inventar, or Inventory. And it's a way of kind of taking stock of different scales in building. But the game, and so there are 5 games that deal with different scales, like materiality, the building scale, and the urban scale. But the game we want to talk about is called Wirtschaft und Krise. And it's based on the idea of a sort of full-size snakes and ladders game, which is familiar to some Germans, but not all. So we realized this was like not necessarily the most common game to play, but we also twist the rules on all of the games a little bit. So you don't need to know the original game to play. The rules in this case are that you choose a typology. So you can choose a single family house, a castle, an apartment building, a caravan, a tent, or seasteading. And then instead of rolling a dice to figure out whether your player moves forward or backwards, you take one of these cards, which has a kind of scenario on it, describing all of the different crises that actually we're already going through.
Just 20 of the crises that could befall you at any given moment in the modern age, but particularly ones that could, I guess, happen.
That might affect
that would be
through a building typology.
Yeah, exactly. Through an architectural lens, through the problem of housing, through the problem of.
So in a way, the exhibition wasn't directly around sustainability, but each of the various games has aspects that ask the young people. There's generally aged at the high school level that would come there as a class group to come into discussion about kind of how architecture and the built environment intersects with their life and along the problems that we're facing today as society. So this one is probably the most intense. And as Alex mentioned, we had 20 crises and one card that claimed alles wird gut, which may be a crisis as well, in my opinion, 21. Things like war, earthquakes, recession, pandemics, overheating, hateful graffiti, gentrification.
Unplanned gentrification.
Unplanned
Planned
gentrification.
gentrification.
Yeah, and many others.
Yeah, I mean, this was intended as a talking piece, as it were, like a conversation game. And we would love to continue that with you guys as well. Are we ready to do that? Come to an end?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then we would love to also have questions from you guys and any dialogue at all. And I would just say that we are also selling titles from Plural Studio to fundraise for the Radio Against Repression podcast, which were mentioned earlier. So if you want to approach me for books, that's also available. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.
We really hope we've inspired you to have some questions or discussion with us. We know it's not like the most straightforward overlap between architecture and your everyday lives. We had a really amazing conversation with you guys. Was it February or March that we had a nice lunch together and talked for a while? So maybe something has come up where you can see some comment or have some questions.
I have two questions. Like one is just an easy one about one of the projects, the one in Galicia.
Mm-hmm.
Is this project, is it like still going on? Is it like people always going there, like other people doing something and then it's leaving again, like residencies?
So this project is really also really inspirational because although a friend of mine bought the property, he's now devolved it to be a community ownership. So, or it's headed that way. So it's still a place where you can go, anyone can go there. And if you participate in the maintenance of the site, you can stay in that regard, or you can pay to stay and support while you do writing projects or any kind of project that you want as a sort of more normal residency style. But they've worked with the Mietsyndikat, which is also quite active in Berlin, to transition that building as well as some of the others into models where people don't buy the land themselves. My friend did buy this land, but he's worked with the lawyers in the legal system there to do this property devolvement. But then some of the other properties, as the villages and as we see like all over Europe, there's a lot of drain from the countryside into cities. So then there are unused Leerstand buildings and places that really need care and maintenance. And people want to do it, but they don't necessarily have the funds to buy the property. So they work with the Mietsyndikat to buy, and then they kind of rent inside of that system some of the buildings there as well. So there's kind of a growing reinvigoration of Bravos through the project as well, and a good relationship with the community there.
And then a second question, which is more general, like, in general, what you do, and like, thanks for the talk as well. It was very interesting to see also like all the different things that you're diving into, and also because of like what's happening in the world and so on, your topics seem to be very, or at least some of them are very like, dealing with what's happening at the moment in the world. And I'm just curious if that is helping you to like deal with the news and everything, if it's like making you be more optimistic or the opposite, or if it just is in some way helping you to, I don't know, deal with it. And if you chose to like, okay, like do this project because it is connected to this actual topic somewhere in the world, or is it more like by coincidence, and then you
yeah, I mean, I think the situations that are unfolding now that are now getting closer to the global north have been going on for centuries for the global south. So it's more a sense that through an interest in history, one arrives at the types of mutual aid and collaboration that have been going on, for centuries and centuries. And so one then learns that if one is serious about coping with or dealing with or trying to prepare for a worsening situation in terms of totalitarianism, censorship, all these things, that you don't have to start from scratch, right? So it actually informs the present to be aware of how these movements have come together in the past, not always successfully by any means, and not ever without some sort of conflict. But yes, so in that sense, I'm personally not looking for a world where I don't have problems, because I don't think it's possible, and I also don't think it's very interesting. So at the moment, we are occupying the space opposite the Bundestag. So the Besatzung gegen Besetzung is still going on. I've been there every day since it started on Friday. I'm doing various different things there. But what you really recognize there is twofold. One, you are faced immediately with the forms of intimidation and aggression from the police, which is like constant, actually. It's just nonstop. They're constantly trying to find some way of intimidating you. They're constantly walking around, checking tents, lifting things up, probably bored out of their brains, but like costing us a lot of money as taxpayers. And then you get, of course, the counterpoint to that, which is that we're all sitting together and working this stuff out together. And that overall is a very enriched form of being present, which I think that's really what it's all about, is just being present. So, the work is about being present. The work as the individual is about being present. And the work as an activist, as an artist, as a poet, really as a human being, is about being present. And the more that we nurture being present, the more prepared we are for going forwards, no matter what happens. Would be my argument.
And I think for me, it's like protest is only effective when it comes along with new projects for the future. So that's where I think architecture and art kind of come into societal change, is that we're like fundamental to dealing with the present moment in order to project into the future and build a future that is going in a direction that we as a society would like to see. And so when I step into new projects, or I take on responsibility of collaborating with people, it's about creating a future that I think involves the people that are working together for a good future. And that made it a lot easier for me to stop working full-time at offices and stop thinking, it's the most important thing for me to do as an architect is to build the next project, but instead that I can give myself the room to say, it might be another year before we have another architecture project. It's okay, because in the end, like, you're always working on being together with the things that you believe in then.
Yeah, and working towards a client, right? You don't know who the client is, but I was thinking, and I talk about it a little bit in my recent book, is like one of the ways you could think of cultural epigenetics through the lens of class, right? Because the working classes have to be creative every single day to recreate day-to-day life. And the upper classes are constantly reaffirming their position as dominant over the working classes. So there's this duality of fixity and rhythm and creativity and mutation. And every time that Anna and I bring our forces together, let's say, or bring our client base together, and you bring in an architect, like an actual architect, right, into like the camp or into the anti-racist theater, their eyes light up like, oh yeah, this is this, da-da-da. And they have all these plans and all this energy and all these ideas about what would happen next, but there's very little contact with someone that's actually going to facilitate that happening. So it's very generative.
Yeah. So this is like kind of a slice of our work, because we've also done collaborations with the theater, with the Subtext Radio. We've built booths for this. We've also made renovations for restaurants and extensions, but somehow we wanted to frame today in a way that helps us to think about, well, how do we deal with where we are?
Yeah. Yeah.
Other ideas, other comments?
Well, as an architect, especially, I think you think about the idea that the architecture can change society.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it certainly does, to some extent. And yeah, just for this, how could architecture well actually change society, or drift society in a way that's more like kind of like coming together, or like more people more trying to or are able to find themselves, kind of.
Mm. This
so not in kind of a church or something. So that,
yeah.
So, but I think the main idea is more that creating buildings that kind of shift people, or give people the possibility to evolve whatever direction automatically, basically.
This was the question that I was kind of also going after with my novel. And I think that the common answer is that we need more spaces for people to be together. And at the time when I was writing this, 2019 to 2023, there was also a problem of people feeling like they couldn't actually make a difference in the world. And that, to me, led to some of these questions around memorialization, because that means that we also maybe need to, like starting sentence of the book is, the architecture of agency is the architecture of the cemetery. The power to change is the power to say goodbye. And so there are 3 cemeteries in the book as proposals for places for people to kind of grieve the messed up world that we live in, the messed up things that are happening around, especially a surveillance society, and what we've kind of been led to believe are things that might help us, but which we may be better off putting an end to this kind of story. And that was sort of my proposal in this fictional way of grieving and coming to terms with something that maybe doesn't need to happen. And so on the one hand, yes, there are places that come together, but maybe there's also a chance to have spaces for reflection about things that should stop. And that was also one of the reasons why we started Plural Studio as books and builds. That was kind of our tagline, as books seem to be like a place that, and spaces for books seem to be a places that people could have conversations and open up reflection.
Inherently public spaces, yeah. I mean, I mean, for me, I think. Luckily, we have backup mic, so it's fine. But yeah, I mean, it has to be a kind of a regulation question, I think, or a political question, because people tend to take the path of least resistance, and unless you say, you know, like a certain amount of building, or maybe a larger amount of building has to be built in a certain way, or, I mean, I think anyway, like the position of the studio is to stop building anyway. So then if you were working with, you know, a renovation and a kind of a permaculture perspective, then yes, maybe you could get people involved. But the fact is that we're all playing this game of capitalism where we have no free time, and there's no way to kind of just like, everything is so, what's the word, like extracted, everything is extracted away from the 99%, which means that there is not time to kind of engage in this idea of like, what would my urban environment be like? It's more like, I think that the people should change the architecture than the architecture should change the people. But I can see that, you know, certain buildings perform these functions, but they never seem to perform them quite the way they're expected to do so. And I think they're also quite deliberate in their idea of who they're for. and who they're not for, and like which types of like social behavior are kind of supposed to be hidden in that part of society or that part of the city. And yeah, it's a shame. I mean, I was working with wastelands for a long time, for about a decade, doing this interdisciplinary research project of urban wastelands around the world. And they seemed like a pretty kind of exciting place to question all of these different things. But of course, they themselves are temporary phenomena which get developed and disappear. So that kind of commons gets eroded from the city as well. And people need to take a risk, and I think people need to take an initiative, especially in Germany where you can actually get things done. In Britain, it's such a private ownership culture. It's much harder to imagine a public space being like community designed or something in a meaningful way.
Mm.
You know?
I love this idea that people should change the buildings more than the buildings should change the people. And it kind of reminds me of another novel called News from Nowhere, which was written by William Morris, who's kind of more well known for his fancy wallpapers of like flowers and patterns. But he was actually like a socialist and had several very interesting writings from before Marx. And in News from Nowhere, he is doing a kind of science fiction for the year 2015, in which the people of London have turned to a socialist society, and they are pulling down the buildings and rebuilding them, and none of the children have to go to school, and instead they kind of decide for themselves what to do with their time, if it's like carving pipes or being store keepers and things like this. So very much a craft-oriented future was what he would have liked to see as a way to kind of also bring art and craft into people's everyday lives, in which the power structures also needed to be pulled down and changed.
Yeah, and
physically,
yeah.
right? And changed by people's handwork and turned into sort of a more social place.
I mean, these conversations about what progressive future might look like in Germany are happening every day at the camp opposite the Bundestag. I mean, I would really encourage everyone to come down, because it's those people, it's people like who are engaged with activism, who are like trying to imagine and are faced with the actual real barriers to shaping society against the status quo. And of course, not everything there is about like architecture, but if you want to think about like a grassroots movement, that's where, you know, some of the greatest people in society are living at the moment. And they're there, they're available, come and speak to us, you know. Yeah.
First, thank you for the inspiration. And I just have 2 questions. And the first one is, are you involved with any community project at the moment, like in Spain? Here in Berlin? Yeah.
I think Alex is involved with this camp right now. And I've been involved with the Architects for Future group, and trying to figure out ways to join the way that they're interacting with changing the built environment. I'm going to be giving a set of 2 intersectional climate walks on this coming Friday and Monday, or sorry, this coming Tuesday. So in a week from today, around the demands that they have for sustainability in the built environment, intersected with women's movements themes, in like by looking at some of the physical spaces in Friedrichshain. So those, I think, are where we're focused right now.
Yeah,
we don't have like a building project with the community at this very moment.
No, nothing building at the moment, but I'm more and more involved with the defunded and censored art community in Berlin. Yeah, unfortunately. That's a big problem. But there's only so much I can say about that.
And the other is like any advice on how to live and experience architecture in a more unconventional or alternative way?
That's a great question. Thank you. I guess, I mean, what I've learned over the last few years interacting with architecture, no, but I think, you know, it's not that it's really the discipline of one thing or another. It's kind of, especially in Berlin, it's the people who are interested in those kind of parameters where the disciplines start to break down, and maybe like social science begins, or maybe other forms of research are being carried out that involve social projects, that involve theaters, activism, what have you. So I would simply suggest to look for people who have got like a particularly kind of critical approach to what they're doing, let's say in architecture, because they will probably then have an open mind about other forms of disciplinarity that can be informed and intersected with that. So, you know, as a non-architect, that would be my approach.
I would suggest maybe reading my book, not in a, it sounds awful, but it's also just like as a way to kind of lose yourself in various ways that architecture can be thought about in imaginative and kind of subversive ways. I think that's a lot also something that I was exploring and talk about in relationship to also architects like Shigeru Ban or John Haydock or the metabolists in Japan. So there's certainly like ways to do it physically and then ways to do it for yourself where you invest some time in your own kind of study and research, which can be just as worthwhile to make hand drawings or read other plans of other people's buildings.
And we would recommend going to Bravos as well.
Oh,
to
yeah.
do some work there. It's great. It's a great experience, and you're from Spain anyway. But if you're there, if you're in the region, I mean, it's all up. I don't know where you're from in Spain, but it's a really interesting group of people that find their way there. So.
And they are part of a larger network of spaces seeking kind of free space for communication between groups of people, not just for art or architecture, but places where you can have open conversations.
We're going to be in a competition for the last word now, but
yeah.
I wanted to say, as Donna Haraway says, stay with the trouble.
We've got to see if there aren't further questions.
Oh, sorry, I just assumed everyone was exhausted.
Otherwise, I'll agree.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.